I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Dustbowl Diatribes is a Maurin Academy podcast.
With having to lock the cat up, or with the cat?
Yeah, no, the cat having to lock it up. I have cats that usually are good, but every once in a while, they're both fighting with each other and racing around, and we'll get right on the table or wherever I'm at, and they're out of control. So I have to put them in kitty jail. It's not
where
fun.
I'm sure they're rehabilitated.
Yeah, eventually. But at first, they try to escape.
I've never found a penitent cat.
They just store up more energy to cause more chaos when they're finally let out.
Right. Or they fall asleep.
All right. Welcome back to another episode of Dustbowl Diatribes. This month we have on Spencer Leonard, who is a professor of sociology, a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society, and a former editor at Sublation magazine. And we're here kind of following up on an interview he did with Douglas Lane a month or two ago that was released as Horkheimer on Reason, Egoism, and Freedom. And Spencer, you said a lot of things in that podcast that, for me were very resonant. And, you tossed it off as like a paragraph, but meanwhile, like books could be written about what you were talking about when you talked about like the bourgeois revolution constituting a cosmological and an anthropological revolution. So could you talk a bit about all of that?
Oh my goodness. I can't remember what I said. I think there are two things. There's what the bourgeois revolution meant to just, use traditional language, the revolutionary bourgeoisie, which really isn't about the bourgeoisie as a class. It's about urban social life. And, of course, the bourgeois revolution was conducted in a lot of, under a lot of sort of ideological guises. Most, in a primordial way, of course, Protestantism or Counter-Reformation. It was religiously motivated. But as it developed into the 18th century, arguably because the bourgeois revolution went into a crisis as a bourgeois revolution, like not because of capital, but simply because of its, in a sense, stalling and failing in itself. The example would be, the British, right? Like what caused the Americans to revolt, basically what caused some British people to revolt against the British Revolution, which after all, was just a provincial expression of a much wider discontent that extended into the British Isles themselves. For a lot of reasons, there's a kind of high Enlightenment. Right? There's a kind of high bourgeois revolution that we think of as the American and French revolutions. And those revolutions took place with a secular account of themselves as a revolutionary transformation in the nature of social life. And they were pretty clear about that. So, for instance, Adam Smith speaks of his society as commercial society, right? This is a commercial society in which every man is a merchant, even if all that he has to sell is his labor. That's in paraphrase. I'm not sure if I'm quoting that exactly from Book 1 of The Wealth of Nations. But there would be many other examples of this. And really everything that feeds into the high Enlightenment is about the specification of where we are historically and what this thing that we're about is. Now, and arguably, well, I would put it to you this way. For them, it was a break and something new. And it was also a culmination and a perfection of what had been. So for the bourgeois thinkers, for the Enlightenment radicals, for the Enlightenment at its best and most reflective, bourgeois society was a perfection of civilization, right? It was so in some sense there had always, to put it again in sort of Adam Smith political economy terms, there had always been wages and profits and rents, but those things had been confused with power, right? So the ruling class weren't just rent takers, they were aristocrats, right? They weren't just profiting, but they were merchant princes. Now that's being clarified, as it were, in the nature of society, at least as class society, as it has existed since the emergence of civil society, since the emergence of private property, since the emergence of agriculture, is being perfected. Now, I don't know, how exactly I was putting it, but of course, then there's the question of bourgeois society under capitalism. And that's a different matter. And that raises the question of, of course, in light of its potential, in light of bourgeois society not being a culmination, but being a transitional state, however pathological, however imperfectly that transition is taking place. It, of course, in Marx's famous terms, holds the capacity to render the history of civilization a kind of prehistory. A prehistory in which you might say reason existed, but not in reasonable form. And in that, so bourgeois society, in light of its kind of culmination in the Industrial Revolution, its culmination in crisis in the Industrial Revolution, is clearly a transformation in humanity as profound as the Neolithic Revolution itself. The transition from hunters and gatherers to agricultural civilization. I don't know if that's what I was talking about, but You
I
know,
think so. And then at the risk of being too Cartesian, would you say that revolution has both like a subjective and an objective dimension? Or
of
would
course, of course.
and can you expand on,
And
yeah, just expand on that.
I mean, on the one hand, you could say that bourgeois society, and this is again, just to talk about it in classical Enlightenment terms, how did they think about it? They thought about it as a kind of lucky strike in some sense, right? That bourgeois society had emerged without anybody exactly willing it into existence. And clearly that's the case because in some sense, historically, it's very hard to say when is bourgeois society not emerging? Is bourgeois society emerging in classical Athens? Well, in some sense, yes. Classical Athens gave us two of our greatest bourgeois philosophers, right? Plato and Aristotle, three, including Socrates. Where would bourgeois society be without these philosophers? On the other hand, it's a form of society that had to get clear about itself in order to consolidate itself. It's a struggle for consciousness. So, to take, the example that I'm just, by happenstance sort of alighting upon Smith, people demanded to be wage laborers. Right, commercial society was something that was actively demanded. It is what, say, the American Revolution is about. It's a political demand for the consolidation of society, to give that society scope, right? Or in the terms of the Abbé Sieyès, the third estate demands to be something, right? It demands to be allowed to be what it is, and in as much as it can register its demands in the French Revolution, of course, it will be transformed thereby, right? Its acknowledgement in the law will transform it and give it greater scope and allow it to flourish further. And so there is a dimension, a struggle for consciousness that one can speak of. In book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith talks about bourgeois society as just arising from individuals' sort of escape, desire to escape from oppression. People flee, their status as serfs in the countryside, and they come to the city where they demand to of course, to live, and the only way that they can live is as wage laborers. They, in a sense, come to the city to make job, right? It can't be that the guilds can fully control the labor market. That medieval forms, can't fully contain this spontaneous movement, and he describes it as a conscious slave revolt of Europe, right? That bourgeois society is the result of a deliberate slave revolt of the of the people. So it's both and, but in the face of its in the face of the overwhelming character of history and the unmasterability of the bourgeois revolution, as exemplified in, say, the French Revolution, you get this sort of strong statement by like a Hegel, that the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, right? That we can only really grasp what's going on in a kind of retrospective way, right? Now, that's not Marx and Marxism's perspective on this, but that is the classical bourgeois way of thinking about it. In other words, there is a form of subjectivity that is demanding scope for that form of subjectivity as well as for forms of objectivity, right? It's demanding an expansion of the practice that's supporting and transforming the subject itself.
So, yeah, could we talk a little bit more about the French Revolution? You said at some point in the interview that, more or less, what I remember is that the bourgeois revolution points to Hitler, which to me meant, there's a sort of kernel of extremism in it, or, that it's sort of like it's going to unfurl in this direction. And the French Revolution happens prior to what we would recognize as full-blown capitalism, right? I mean, more like of the type of expression that you were describing, and yet in it there's this just incredible extremism that you would recognize in a totalitarian regime of whatever kind, whether fascist or communist later as well. When you said that the bourgeois revolution or those events point to Hitler, were you thinking more of the ideology of emancipation that you were talking about leading there, even though it may be kind of a false story? I think I agree it is. Or were you talking more about the impact of capitalism leading there?
Well, I was discussing in that interview with Doug Lane an essay by Horkheimer, which I believe is from 1936, called "Egoism and Freedom Movements," and in it he traces Hitler, in a sense, back beyond the demagogues of the French Revolution into the demagogues of the Italian city-states. In other words, to the earliest conscious expression of the bourgeois revolution. And what he's trying to get at, he's trying to get at a number of things. First of all, there's a widespread liberal argument that Hitler exposes democratic demagoguery, right? So there's a kind of conservative liberal critique of really the Enlightenment and to the extent that the bourgeois revolution is also a demand for democracy, and that's a complex question, but which ultimately implicates socialism. And what Horkheimer is trying to say is a number of things. The arch point is that we have to view history from the point of view of the present. It's in a sense, an arch Hegelian point. So how does the rise of fascism transform the past? Right? And in that sense, there's no sort of historicist. You can't shelter the past in this kind. You can't sort of put it over here in this historicist box and say, well, that's not really very explanatory for the French Revolution, right? Because ultimately, if the past isn't bearing upon the present, it's meaningless. Right. So Horkheimer's taking that up and he's saying, well, what is the rational core of these conservative complaints about Hitler and of course, Stalinism, right? Because, he's very aware of the democratic character of the Stalinist regime, right? That you whip up a kind of demagogically whip up a, say in, the campaign against the kulaks, right? That's a democratic campaign, right? That's horrific. And so Horkheimer is saying that. He's saying that the bourgeois revolution repeats, right? We're not done with it. It's not done with us. And in the 1930s and 40s, this is where we are. When you get to like the dialectic of enlightenment, he's going to argue that the whole history of reason culminates in fascism, right? Going back into prehistory, right? So he's, going, even into like the rights of hunters and gatherers, which are early, of course, attempts at reason and the control of nature. And, of course, famously describes mythology as a form of enlightenment. That mythology is an attempt to unmask the old relationship to nature and to bring. So he views Homer as a kind of enlightenment figure, right? Who is rationalizing earlier Greek paganism, right? Why would he say that? Because he's saying the whole of human history is consumed in the present, right? That the whole of human history is bound up with our project of freedom now. And if the entire project of human freedom guided by reason has descended into fascism and self-domination, then that casts a retrospective light on the whole of humanity, right? That's the critical point. So it's a parallel to the point that he's making in egoism and the freedom movements with respect to democracy, right? What looks like a history of democracy is in fact a history of the perfection of the self-domination of man through self-determination, democratic self-determination, right? It's a dialectical inversion.
So then where do you understand Horkheimer, Adorno, the Frankfurt School going with that? Because I think you and Chris and Platypus read them somewhat different than, you're not just, I feel like the standard leftist critique is, oh, they're just assholes sitting in the Grand Hotel Abyss, sneering at any attempt to do anything productive. How do you guys read them otherwise?
Well, I mean, I would say that they're the only optimists. They are saying that the question of socialism is posed by fascism, right? The question of socialism is posed by state capitalism, right? Now, they're not exactly political thinkers in the sense that for them, history has shown, the history of socialism has shown the necessity of the development of working class political forms. And crucial among those is the one that crystallizes the subjective factor in history. In other words, crystallizes the ability to, in a sense, bring subjectivity to bear. And that's the political party, like the political party for socialism. And they see the political party for socialism as having liquidated itself. Right. So there's all, the whole problem of the Frankfurt School, if you will, is that they can't be party intellectuals. Right. They can't, there was a place for these, effete Jewish and overeducated Jewish intellectuals in Central Europe, right? And that was in the Social Democratic Party of Germany or the Communist Party of Germany. But by the late 1920s, it's clear that that place is gone. They can see it in the fate of Gerd Lukács and Karl Korsch in the 20s. And by the 30s, they agree, I would say they broadly speaking, they agree with the likes of Leon Trotsky, that there's a need for an entire new party political formation. What Trotsky hopes to build is the Fourth International, which is an abortive project that isn't realized. And for them, they decide that we have to, as Marxist intellectuals who can't be Marxists in the sense of party intellectuals, we're doing something unprecedented here, which is trying to preserve the memory of Marxism. Get these metaphors of like a message in a bottle. But they don't think that the struggle for socialism is over. Right? They think that there is a history that has collapsed in failure. It's not the first time. And they think that there will be someone to receive the message of Marxism. But they don't think history has refuted Marxism. I mean, it has, but nothing has taken its place. Right? That's the question, right? Marxism obviously lies in ruins in 1942, in the midnight of the 20th century, from which there really has been no recovery. Right? They think of fascism, like any Marxist does, as essentially counter-revolutionary, that it's destroying the socialist workers' movement in Europe, and it does that. And we haven't recovered. And the prospects of socialism in America were frustrated even without that destruction. It was destroyed in the United States since more organically as Stalinism, as the Stalinization of American socialism. So they think that socialism has been defeated, but socialism's only resource has been its historical defeats, right? That's how socialism has, in a sense, developed. And so they're optimistic, and that's just in the sense that they're still holding on to the prospect of socialism. They're still Marxists, and they think that they're holding on to that horizon of possibility, rather than in one way or another anointing the status quo as inevitable, which is what is happening both on the social democratic side and the communist side after World War II. They see that as, in fact, they see that in classical orthodox terms. This is just reformism, right? These are species of reformism. We've seen socialism as justifying the status quo before, and so that's where they, this is a kind of a foundational issue, like the one you're touching on, for my own thinking, because these are the conversations that Chris and I were having in like 1999, 2000, because we were studying with the Frankfurt School scholar, Moishe Festone. who was arguing, in effect, classically in the sense of, a typical perspective that the Frankfurt School were pessimistic, right? And he thought that that was because they could no longer explain the contradiction of capitalism in, because of the limitations of their understanding of Marx. So he understood them as traditional Marxists. And yet they gnawed at him as at his intellectual conscience. He had an intellectual conscience. Moish did, in the sense that he suspected, and of course Chris and I were there to chip away at this, that maybe you're not maybe the parts that that your eyes are glazing over, right, when you read this stuff, it's a funny phenomenon that, young people or anybody, right, you read Hegel, you read Marx, and kind of your eyes glaze over at the bits that you don't understand, right? So I remember a class that Chris and I were in on Adorno's negative dialectics. And, we were just pushing Moish, like, can you kind of can you put this book in this box that you've created, traditional Marxism? And it was a remarkable thing that I credit Moish highly for. Can't imagine, in fact, it happening now. He actually would, in that class, we kept on going back to the beginning of the book. Right? So we would kind of recursively, we were advancing, but we were also going back, because we kept on pointing to the entire dialectic of the argument and blah blah blah, and Moish, confessed, I think, pretty clearly that he wasn't sure what he thought about it, and whether or not an argument that he'd made in print about the Frankfurt School's pessimism could really be sustained. And I would say that, for me, it was crucial for my friendship with Chris. I was very close to Moish. I was his research assistant for about 5 years, and engaged in a very kind of close dialogue with him about both of these issues that we've raised: the relationship of the bourgeois revolution and liberalism to Marxism. For instance, the relationship of Adam Smith to Karl Marx in the Critique of Political Economy, and this question of the post-Marxist world. Like a lot of 60s people, Moish wanted to read Marx as a kind of prophet of the 20th century. That perhaps Marx has never really had any purchase on the world till now, because now we're really in a position to abolish labor, right? Given the cybernetic revolution or whatever in the 60s and the 70s, the kind of the rebellion, the rejection of work that you see in, I think that some of the strikes in America in the 1960s, where you had like long-haired working class kids coming back from Vietnam and striking not for wages, but for striking against the drudgery of factory labor in the 1970s. So Moish looked at that as an expression of the new sensibility of the 60s expressed in the working class, and anticipating or giving voice to the need for a kind of post-work world that he read out of Marx. But I think he was very weak when it came to what certainly Chris is, the ultimate expression of political Marxism. The memory of political Marxism. Moish, as a political thinker, was really, fairly, hopeless. Ultimately, a kind of Democrat, a kind of Stalinist, thought history itself was going to take care of the problem. Maybe technology. You still get this with kids. Cell phones are going to abolish capitalism, or something. Just giving you a bit of sort of my backstory and where we were before the foundation, before we created Platypus, before we began to have our own students and really think about their emerging politicization. That really was the meeting of those two things that led to Platypus.
Yeah. Well, so let me try and re-summarize what I take to be the core of like the Marxism you're presenting, or kind of the recovery of the original Marxist vision from Marx through Lenin through the Frankfurt School. Would it be fair to say that the core of the long bourgeois revolution, if we include, from like the Renaissance to the Frankfurt School, let's say, would it be fair to say that the core of that is the claim that individual human beings should be free to associate with other workers and to control not just like the means of production in like a quote unquote traditional Marxist way, but should be free to create and recreate themselves and their society, kind of on their own terms, both individually and collectively? Is that too abstract, and or misguided? What do you say to that?
I mean, I guess I'm going to sound very orthodox here. I'll put it this way. If we think about in American history, a classic case that's come up in recent years is the 1619 Project, right? People can't understand how the American Revolution isn't hypocritical, right? They find a figure like Thomas Jefferson to be utterly inexplicable, right? I think of Thomas Jefferson in very traditional historiographic terms, right? He's the soul of the American Revolution. He's the visionary of the American Revolution. It's no accident that he wrote the Declaration of Independence. I agree that his election in 1800 was a great restoration of the revolution, defense of the revolution. Now he's a figure that, obviously much reviled, but more importantly, utterly shrouded in confusion. People can't explain to themselves how the bourgeois revolutionaries, how they envisioned history, right? Because that's really what it's about, right? They thought, we are making a fundamental step towards, in the advancing of freedom. And it's crucial to make this step, even though, the whole American Revolution is a kind of consolation prize, right? The whole project of American independence is a kind of lowering of horizons, right? Because they were trying to participate in a British imperial-wide revolution. They were trying to act in concert with their British comrades. I don't know if you know, some historians claim the American Revolution was more popular in Britain than it was in America, right? That it was simply more possible in America. to, in a sense, overthrow the government than it was in Britain. But there was certainly widespread sympathy in Britain. And the very term patriot had been taken from the British revolutionary, right? It meant followers of William Pitt. So that vision that, slavery is going to be abolished, slavery is abolished in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania. It's going to continue to be. Freedom is unleashed upon the world, right? Or the conception of even a Hegel after the revolution, or Benjamin Constant. Like, yes, the revolution is defeated, but in fact, the genie's out of the bottle. And for Hegel, what has happened in Europe in the 3 centuries up to his mature thought is of world historic significance. If the peasants of China or the nomads of the steppes of Asia haven't heard of the French Revolution, they're still implicated in it because it will be unfolding, right? Now, that enters into crisis, right? Capitalism calls all of that into crisis. It isn't necessarily, first of all, revolution is a misfortune, right? Revolution is a misfortune. It's a failure of politics. It's a failure of public reason, right? And when the revolution returns, it's utterly confusing and disorienting, right? And of course, that return of the revolution and the consciousness of the necessity of that return of the revolution and of the misfortune that is the necessity of the return of the revolution and the problematic character of that return of the revolution, the consciousness of that is Marx and Engels, right? That's the gravamen of their thought, right? Why is there a revolution coming as they imagine in the 1840s, right? Culminating in their writing the manifesto of their party for that revolution, weeks before it breaks out.
And just to be clear, are you saying revolution is a misfortune because theoretically the third estate should be able to just reorganize itself in ways that would be more, I don't want to say moderate because that makes it sound milquetoast, but basically like just outmaneuver in a way the need for political revolution?
Yeah, so in the 18th century, the argument about bourgeois society's superiority to the ancient world, which also meant its superiority to all forms of feudalism and traditionalism, was settled, right? The British conquered, they defeated absolutism on 4 continents in the 18th century, right? The British are extending the bourgeois revolution into Africa, into Asia, into the New World, right? That's the British Empire in the 7 Years' War, right? It's a world historic phenomenon, right? This little backward corner of Europe, right? Where people used to run around painted blue, right? When the Romans were there, right? Just total, the boondocks, right? This has now become a place of world historic significance alongside places like the Netherlands, which were likewise obscure in the history of civilization. And there had then been a series of, in a sense, escalations in the project of bourgeois emancipation with the with the American and French revolutions. And obviously, Napoleon had demonstrated the superiority of bourgeois society, right, to all comers. This was clear, right? And it tasked those people, right? They thought about it, right? Rousseau is asking himself, by what right do we conquer Native Americans? By what right do we conquer hunters and gatherers? Aren't they freer than we are? Right? People like Jefferson and Franklin are saying, we must have a revolution as good Rousseauians, we have to make a revolution in order to cooperatively integrate the native peoples of this continent. Right? You can see that spirit in, for instance, Jefferson's directions to Lewis and Clark, right? Which are about inviting the Native American peoples into cooperative relations as citizens of the Republic, right? Tell them, he says to Lewis and Clark, tell them they are citizens of a republic, right? And they should cultivate their ability to practice agriculture, right? Because that's the way in which we're going to move forward for now. That entire project is thought to be, in a sense, safely in the hands of public discussion, public reason, and political representation. That's what I mean by saying the genie's out of the bottle. They're going to develop forms of political representation in Calcutta. They're going to subordinate the East India Company state to the needs of Indian society. This is what I wrote my dissertation on, right? The bourgeois revolutionary aspirations as regards British expansion into India. Like, what is the Abbé Raynal and Adam Smith and Thomas Paine and others' revolutionary vision for the integration of global cosmopolitan society? That was a question acutely posed by the conquest of Bengal in the 1750s and 60s. With 1848, the revolution returns and its task is uncertain, right? It's colored by this index, this symptom of a crisis, namely the social question, right? This problem of, well, if our form of freedom is rooted in cooperative labor, where my talents and abilities serve you as yours do me through cooperative wage labor, right? A system of cooperation rooted in wage labor. What if labor is unavailable? Right? What if going to work means putting yourself or others out of work? What if realizing labor derealizes labor, to use the kind of language of Marx in the 1844 manuscripts? Right? That question raises the issue of democracy in an acute way that comes into contradiction with liberalism. Right? We begin to have this phenomenon of, like, of liberal democracy, right? Which is an unstable contradiction, right? Democracy with all of its illiberalism, and liberalism with all of its mistrust of majoritarianism, right? So this question of the crisis of modern politics, this emergence of the the primacy of politics, of mass politics, of mass political parties, of revolutionary parties, right? Of socialism. Socialism is the vanguard of the democratic revolution. Right? That's a problem of capital, which seems to require, which in its recursivity and its circularity and its kind of cyclical character, keeps coming back to the bourgeois revolution, right? For Marx, the problem is the repetition of the bourgeois revolution under conditions of capital. That's 1848. That's the question that he's raising. And it requires, on bourgeois grounds, on the grounds of preserving the society of labor, the seizure of power by the working class for Marx. Right? That's the lesson that he draws from the revolution of 1848. Right? Which of course will be viewed as, fascist, as highly illiberal, right? It's liberal in its inspiration because it's about preserving the form of bourgeois society rooted in labor, even as it requires, perhaps the most fully developed form of democratic movement ever seen. Right? A form of movement that at the same time constitutes a critique of formal democracy because it operates independently of capitalist democracy.
And doesn't it require a great deal of self-possession and control and reason on the part of ordinary people to constitute themselves in that manner and actually govern themselves? And isn't that the biggest obstacle? And I'm thinking of both the rise of fascism back then, as well as the current upswing in something similar, populism of some kind, as kind of a substitute for responsible democratic action. And I wonder if, I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I see it as just kind of tragic. Like we have enough reason to have these aspirations and vision of how we could govern ourselves and use our resources better. We've got all the ingredients, but we don't have people even today who seem to be even wanting to have that kind of agency, let alone capable of exercising it. How do you see that? Like, how do you personally handle that issue? Or do you see it the same way, first of all?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think that, there's like an aversion to, I don't want to go too much into the present, but there's an aversion to relationships, just personal relationships. I think, true friendship is difficult today. Whether in an eroticized context of marriage or long-term partnership, or friendship, as it were, per se. I think civil society institutions, meeting IRL, meeting in real life and doing things cooperatively. There's a lot of aversion to that, which is, some kind of grappling with, it seems to be like a psychological issue. But without dwelling on that overly much, I think that a very great deal of our society is bound up. I would say that we need to develop society in order to develop politics, a politics that in some sense could inherit the kind of horizon of the historical horizon that socialism once represented, if not a simple, whether or not that means like a renewal of the project of socialism somehow, or as I, in a sense, suggested before, the emergence of something that could legitimately claim to succeed that project, to inherit that project. I think it's clear that nothing has inherited the kind of freedom ambition of effectively 19th century socialism. So society has to develop for that to emerge, and that has to emerge for society to develop, right? And there's no silver bullet for that. What I would say in response to your point is that we do have the past to look at. And I'm, as a Marxist, as someone deeply inspired, formed by an engagement with Enlightenment liberalism, I mistrust language, arguments about human nature and its limitations. That people are tribal, or people are inadequately and insufficiently intelligent. There's all sorts of misanthropy that's proliferating today, and I edited a couple of books of Marxist journalism, and it really made me think. Just as an anecdotally. Marx wrote for the American press, wrote for the New York Tribune. It was it had a weekly edition that circulated around the country. Almost certainly, Abraham Lincoln read it, right? It circulated all over America. Of course, Marx's articles were fantastic, and they were included in the weekly edition quite commonly. Almost every one of them that we have. Now, that newspaper was read by people who had far less formal education than prevails today. And when you read those articles, they are at a high level of literacy. These are written by Karl Marx, and he makes no concessions to his readers, even in a 2,500 word news article. He's tossing off Italian and Latin and Greek and allusions to classical mythology, and just full on 19th century erudition. Those articles were probably read aloud they were certainly read aloud to tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of functionally illiterate people, because the newspaper would have been read aloud to those who couldn't read. Now, when you think about a phenomenon like that, what does that tell you as regards these arguments about the limitations of human nature? Right? People, we live in a world where, obviously education is denigrated, right? Who wants to be an overeducated fool, right? College educated people are not to be trusted, right? Of course, these are all sound intuitions, right? College educated people should not be trusted. They have contempt for working class people, right? But there used to be a time where where educated people were not useless. They knew things that were useful, and they would and they weren't contemptuous of other people, right? And therefore they were respected as they respected others. And uneducated people who faced various sorts of deprivation freely acknowledged that they admired those who had the privilege to get an education, and they tried to, of course, help if they're, to try to get their own children to be more educated than they were. Now, that kind of thing, it's a very simple example, but it was rooted in, a much richer society that we have retreated from because and of course it was cultivated in all of these things were deeply cultivated in socialism. And everything that I'm saying about what was true of the circulation of the New York Tribune in the 1850s is, all the more true of socialist workers in the period of like the SPD in Germany, right, where there were reading rooms and obviously mechanics institutes and lectures being given, and so forth and so on, right, where the working class was actively developing its own capacities through its own organizational efforts, right? So I think that those things were dearly bought. I think immense sacrifices were made. I think people struggled to organize and to transform themselves, right? Workers and intellectuals alike. And I don't know how it is the case that that's inherently impossible today. I don't think it's impossible today. I think there are obstacles to that. Those obstacles are really historical obstacles. In a sense, it's the fear of freedom that has emerged from the catastrophe of the project of freedom in the 20th century that has to be worked through.
What if it's partly if anything, work has become for an awful lot of people more and more monotonous and kind of meaningless and kind of degrading, right?
Right.
And everybody in the family works almost regardless of how much money they're making. So the middle class really can no longer afford for one party to like kind of support the family so the other person can go be a public figure, which really hasn't been that long since that disappeared. But it used to be that, not that I'm endorsing this, but that an awful lot of middle class men could spend a whole lot of time out in public, engaging in politics, engaging in local business circles and so on and so forth, and becoming much more informed and understanding the world. That's gone because there really isn't a choice for a lot of people to work. And then I think our education system is training people to fit those kind of drudgery roles, right? Doesn't encourage the kind of curiosity that I agree with you existed not that long ago. But since it's partly structural, that our economy is demanding this way of life from so many people, how could we hope that these people who are like, we interviewed Dave McCarricker not that long ago, and he has of time energy. So many people who have no time energy, basically, to put forward, to actually think things through and act in a concerted fashion. It seems like it has become ever harder to imagine. And that's not to, I'm not trying to be a downer as much as just kind of
sure.
Like, is there any hope that we can overcome this phenomenon that we're dealing with right now so that more people could, because I do agree that more people are capable of a lot more understanding and concerted action than they can currently muster, it seems like.
I mean, I don't think there's anything that I understand that can't readily be explained to common people. I find it to be the case. The obstacle to discussion is more like, what's the point in talking about it? Right? It's more like that. It's not like incomprehension or something like that. I would certainly say that, look, people were overworked in the age of historical socialism. And a lot of their organizing efforts were illegal and extremely fraught for that reason. What are the greatest, examples of historical socialist parties? German Social Democratic Party and the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. I mean, these were organized in extremely adverse conditions, especially in the period of illegality in Germany, and of course in the entire history of Tsarism. I think that the obstacles are more, in a sense, Geistic than that. I don't think it's like literally time and energy. I don't think, I think people have time, and they do a lot. Of course, they're psychologically crippled and all sorts of things, right? There's all sorts of obstacles, but people go to church, people help each other. You see it all the time. I heard you, I can't remember, maybe it was in the podcast about your book, talking about you taking care of your mother, and your dissatisfaction with, I guess it was your mother's own church. You can have those experiences, but I have an aging mother right now, and I'm astounded at how much people help her, and people talk to her, and her ability to make new friends. Her neighbors take out her trash for her. They check up on her. She's active in her church. Her church provides all sorts of scope for socialization, which of course is important for her to stave off isolation and the health consequences that isolation can have. So society is still there. Bourgeois society is still there. Bourgeois cooperation is still there. I teach sociology. I tell students all the time, you may never experience anything but cooperation in society. You may never need the cops ever. Right? The cops may never get involved in your life. They've never been involved in my mother's life, except to tell her to slow down on the highway. I think that society, of course, renews itself. I mean, we've just gone through arguably a massive bourgeois revolution, right? With the crisis of neoliberalism and the political renewal of America, such as it is. But how does it take place? It takes place by assertions of, by the red, white, and blue, and people recalling the American Revolution and demanding their rights, right, and rejecting infringements on free speech. Society remains bourgeois in distress or liberal in distress. I think that, what afflicts it, certainly the way that Platypus would understand that, is a kind of profound historical sickness or sort of unmediated regression in the face of the affirmation of the defeat of socialism. Either claiming that the defeat of socialism is a victory of socialism, a la Stalin and 20th century communism, or affirming the defeat of socialism as though it were merely illiberal and anti-democratic. Right? And that antinomy has dominated the 20th century. And we inherit that. So and I think any kind of politics that is interested in exploring the capacity of individuals to develop themselves through their own activity and to take responsibility for their society and the course of history. In other words, anybody who's interested in, the deliberate achievement of historical freedom in some sense, the deliberate transformation of society, deliberately making society better, deliberately realizing the aspirations of the past, right? Inheriting them as a task and fulfilling that, has to look at historical socialism, right? What we have now, is a kind of desiccation of that, into issue politics, and obviously it's fully inherited in capitalist politics. Like, that's where it exists now. I don't know if that answers your question, Laurie. Or
Definitely helps. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So let's switch gears just a little bit. So you think historical socialism is important in the future, but how would you say religious fits into, what you mentioned a while ago, people that are interested in developing their capacities as individuals and taking responsibility for society? How does religious fit in? How does religious life fit into that?
It's a curious question. What happened to religion, right? One of the things that I would point out is that to the end, if you think of Hegel as the culmination of bourgeois thought of the Enlightenment is the Protestant Reformation to the end. Right? The most radical thinkers of the Enlightenment, figures like Rousseau, insist that they're Christian philosophers, right? Against the materialists, right? Against D'Holbach, against the Salonier, against the Salon radicals of Paris. If you read Rousseau's Confessions, right, he says they don't believe in the self-transformability of man through spirit. They're not Christians. Their materialism is that everything is, as it were, predetermined. And therefore, they're denying the possibility of Christian freedom. Right? Of course, Hegel understands himself in some sense as a Christian, right? You don't have to wait for Nietzsche for people who understand Christianity to be the religion that dissolves itself as a religion into the project of freedom. And then you get people asking, well, and of course you have the attempt to create rational religion, right? Like Robespierre in the French Revolution and the cult of the supreme being. Why religion makes a comeback as like reactionary in the 19th century? Yeah, I would say that what people need to realize is that there's a narrowing of what is meant by religion there. And religion finds other expressions. Right? If you think of, that, depends on how we think about what is religion, right? What is it that takes us out of ourselves? Where do we find courage in the face of fear? Right? How do we overcome ourselves beyond what we can, as it were, rationalize? Durkheim is a great thinker of this. Right? He asks himself, why do people pursue freedom, even if it might destroy them? Where he gives the example of soldiers fighting in a just war, right? Fighting for freedom, right? What causes them to, jump out of their trench and follow the flag, right? That can't be self-interest. They're not going to experience that freedom that they're fighting for. They're not going to experience its benefits. Right? So there's the question of, secular religion. How is the struggle for the redemption of the struggles of the past, right? How is that informed by something that I would consider some kind of, post-religious religion? In the sense that, I think that, Hegel's right. We still, it's a history of philosophy, art, and religion, right? These are different ways of knowing, right? Or something like that. But I think that organized religion is a pretty poor substitute for, in a sense, the full scope of, like, obviously, like football games, people experience like some kind of religious emotion. Rock concerts, they experience some kind of religious emotion. Obviously patriotism. All of these things are, in a sense, inadequate, manifestly. Right. So but yeah, go ahead.
There's this line of reasoning that basically argues, and I'm thinking of Vogelin, for instance, Eric Vogelin, who, would argue that the problem with secular religions is that people place this instinct that basically amounts to a desire to identify with some ultimate transcendent, reality. And they bring it down, right, into the earthly plane and try to enact it as human beings, which leads to kind of a godlike attitude towards other people and towards the environment and so forth that can lead to domination. And so, I definitely recognize there's a whole lot of people who've recognized a certain amount of religiosity in mass movements and in, various, experiences that you talked about, but who caution that because we are so instinctually religious, there's a real danger of placing these big hopes that are beyond the scope of human beings to really realize onto this secular movement. And then in order to achieve those hopes and dreams, force or, moral compromises always become necessary. So I'm just kind of posing the counter argument to what you're saying there. And I wonder what you would say to those kinds of concerns.
I mean, I would say that the attempt to fend off the frenzies of unreason is doomed, right? People get jacked up on a lot of things. They're gonna, I'm a leftist. I know what happens when you take young people or whomever out to a leftist demonstration. People get carried away. My wife is the meekest, sweetest Indian woman you can imagine, right? Speaks with a delightful sort of Queen's English lilt in Indian English. For years, of course, I insisted that she not go to demonstrations with me because she wasn't a citizen, right? A bit like, a wisdom that has been lost in the current pro-Palestinian movement, right? Where American leftists have decided that actual Arabs and Palestinians need to lead the pro-Palestinian movement, right? Which is the height of stupidity if you're organizationally serious, because those people are vulnerable, as we see now, to deportation. But eventually, of course, she gained citizenship. I was teaching at the University of Tennessee. There was a kind of white supremacist rally on the campus of the University of Tennessee, something called the Traditional Workers Party. I took my wife to protest it. There was a platypus chapter there at the University of Tennessee, and platypus always, takes students out to see the left. And Diwali, my wife, came along, and we got to the end of the march route, and there were a lot of young people, and there were a lot of police, and I saw the young people start putting on face masks, this sort of thing. They were going to fight the police, right? As I've seen happen many times before. And I turned to my wife and I said, it's time for us to go now, right? I'm not here for this. And she's like, no, we have to stay. Right? Look at these brave young people. Right? And I was like, we can bail them out later if you want to. If you're really upset about this. But she got carried away. This is what democracy looks like, whatever, standard slogans, just like people got carried away on January 6th, right? It's a heady brew, this democracy thing, right? This modern society thing. But definitely democracy. So, I don't know if that anecdote addresses what you're concerned about. I mean, I think that there will, I just suggested, like, hey, we just went through a very unconscious revolution, right? I remember when I was, it's basic civics class, right? In America, we do at the ballot box what other countries do through, coups and military takeovers. Donald Trump has defeated the political establishment, right? He has defeated the Democratic and the Republican parties. He has transformed, the political horizons, and he's now proceeding to reorganize global politics and trade. This is happening, whether people like it or not, right? Whether they're coming to terms with it, right? It's, we'll know that it's done, when the Democrats legislate with Trump, which I hope they do, right? Maybe they win next year and they pass a bipartisan immigration bill or something to indicate that, something other than just sticking their heads in the sand, right? Is that the only kind of revolution that we want? One that restabilizes capitalism through immense horror, austerity, and war, right? Because that's what we got, right? What brought on Trump was war and austerity, right? He thought that George Bush made a huge mistake with the wars on terror. So he went in 2015 against the Republican neocon establishment and said the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were the greatest foreign policy disaster in American history, directed right at Jeb Bush, right? And that helped propel him to the top of the pack in that primary. And of course, he thought more fundamentally that Obama had wasted a crisis. Rahm Emanuel had said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, but that's exactly what happened for Trump, right? The 2008 world economic crisis for Trump presented an opportunity to reorganize global capitalism, to renegotiate the terms of global trade, such that America would lead a new boom and recovery. That was the project, make America great again so that we make Mexico great again and everyone else, right? It was a world historic project. It wasn't some idiotic, as the idiotic Democrats would have us believe, some atavistic American chest thumping, ignorance of the world or, mere nationalism. No, it's a cosmopolitan vision of an American-led world economy. That's the only revolution we're getting, right? We're not getting anything else. We're not getting anything that addresses the underlying discontents, I would argue, right? We're getting things that address things at a very superficial and symptomatic level, the only level at which capitalist politics can address them. So, yes, socialism would risk all sorts of things, right? I mean, another way of putting it is, and I think Chris said this to you, you can't understand the rise of fascism without the rise of mass political parties for socialism, historically, at all. Right? There's a reason why Mussolini comes out of the socialist movement. Right? There's a reason why the parts of Europe that were most subject to revolution in the wake of 1917 where the revolutionary upheavals were strongest but failed became the epicenters of fascism? Of course there is, right? And that's why there's in other words, people people recoil from socialism with good reason, right? In some sense, politics is an awful burden, right? It's not, just some march towards, the beckoning horizon. And so we attempted to suppress it, I would say. We've attempted to suppress politics as much as possible and to routinize it and to act like, the technocrats are going to be able to manage history. Right? But they can't. Right? And this is why I think the Democrats are so utterly hysterical, so utterly deranged. It's not because of Donald Trump. It's because they faced their helplessness in the face of history. Like they felt it. They haven't faced it, but they felt it. They felt profoundly like, oh, we can't technocratize our way out of this. Right? And I think that has struck terror and brought out some of the, and brought out deeply authoritarian impulses in the ruling classes. Right? We've got to control what these people are saying on Twitter and Facebook. Right? We can't let people have, these rights in the Bill of Rights. Like, this is madness. Right? And of course, Trump is also an enemy. I'm not saying that he's not. He's, of course, an enemy of our rights in a different way. But, there was one rally I remember in 2016 where someone had taken, the painting, I guess it's Delacroix, Liberty Leads the People, right? That is used as the, the image for, what's the musical about the French Revolution?
Les Miserables.
Les Miserables. And they placed it behind Trump. And instead of the French tricolor, it was Trump make America great again. Right. And of course, there's, Trump crossing the Delaware. Right. Like whatever, like all the imagery comes out. Right. Trump himself will say, he's a standard bearer, not so much of the party of Reagan as of the party of Lincoln. Right? Like it's all said. Like, these are, there are deep historical reasons for these things.
So how about this for a concluding question? How do you live in the light of these deep historical reasons? Like, how do you get up in the day? What do you place your hopes in? What do you tell your students? Because I guess anybody who's made it to the end of this hour and a half long podcast is a kind of student of yours in however attenuated a form. So what do you have to say to...
I don't know. It's probably a lot like Laurie. I don't, I suspect. I mean, I take... What would I do if I weren't inspired by my students? Right? If I thought that my students were uneducable, right? That's when I would face despair. Platypus has been very important for me as an adult. I read the bit of Laurie's book that was available on Amazon for free, where she talks about being disappointed with academia and the process of the job market and of professional life. I've experienced that profoundly. Deep disappointment with my profession, with the anti-intellectualism. I mean, the university is, at this point, is like a debate-free zone. It's astounding. You can have more debate at McDonald's than you can in a faculty meeting, right? I had the disconcerting experience, which I probably mentioned before, in public, of, I'm a failed academic. I'm an adjunct, just like Chris is. I have to share an office, or used to. And I talked to my really quite lovely, decent office mate. And I said to her, I think the Ukrainian counteroffensive in eastern Ukraine has stalled out. I think it can't be renewed. If you remember that stage in the war where it became clear that the Russians couldn't be displaced out of the Russian majority provinces that were part of the casus belli. And she looked at me like I'd farted out loud for just mentioning this simple fact of military reality. It was like I was, Chris experiences this all the time. He's much more forward than I am in taking stands with respect to mainstream politics. Chris is so utterly and thoroughly canceled at this point. But if he explains what's going on with Trump, for instance, he's taken to endorse it. Right? If you explain the way the world is to a degree now, especially to academics, that itself is a taboo violation. It's astounding. And of course, for me personally, I'm a historian of South Asia. Right? I spent my young adulthood mastering, a handful of languages from India, the most difficult of which was Sanskrit, which took years to master. And, I found that if you were interested in the history of South Asia, but you weren't an Indian nationalist, you couldn't get a job. The vast majority of my colleagues are, of course, from India or Pakistan and middle class, and deliver a kind of middle class nationalist account about how everything is different in the post-colonial world. Right? And when you say, well, actually, no, what's going on in the post-colonial world is capitalism. And what Indian intellectuals are forms of liberal and leftist, etc. Right? This isn't incomprehensible. And actually, the question of wage labor is a question of hearth and home for the people of South Asia. And these languages are different and this culture is different, but it's not unexplainable, right? It's not, it certainly doesn't represent some challenge, some insuperable challenge to master narratives or whatever, right? The way that post-colonialism is, posed for decades. I remember going for, Laurie talked about, these job interview experiences. I had absurd experiences, right? It was right there on my resume, all the research that I'd done, all the languages that I knew. And I would go in and I would talk to people clearly about history in a way that could relate to the history of Africa and the history of South America and the history of Europe and the Middle East and China. And they would say, have you ever been to India? Because everybody that they interviewed was telling them that that world history was impossible, right? That it was a history of difference, or it was some bullshit proto-racial capitalism argument, right? So I found all of this to be extremely, and I don't mean to be arrogant, but I was one of the best students at the best program in the world for South Asian history, right? And I just saw mediocrity flourish. I saw my wife be told, she came to America to study German literature, and she was told, this very much resonates with what Laurie writes about. She's a girl from Calcutta, and they told her, well, you really ought to study women's literature. And you ought to study the literature of your own language. And of course, she was not only coming to study, but she was coming to immigrate. And so she listened to that advice. But even down to today, when she's a full professor, these well-meaning progressive liberals will tell her, oh, maybe you shouldn't teach a class on English literature, which of course she's profoundly trained in and fully capable of doing. Right? It's a horror, right? Intellectual life in our time, right? Publications collapsing, right? Who reads the New York Review of Books? Who reads anything, right? The New Republic, the Atlantic. These things are highly degenerate. We live in a deeply intellectually regressive age. And creating an organization and an environment where I could teach and speak has been extremely important to me, right? Obviously, we have got, we are in a position where we're trying to figure out how to reconstitute these things, right? How to, Doug Lane, how can we have a left publisher, right? Chris and I are canceled amongst left publishers. Because we're insufficiently militant about Palestine or something. I don't know what it is, right? Or about imperialism, or about Trump, or about something, right? Because we're interested in the question of achieving socialism in the real world rather than some kind of psychological satisfaction about confirming that we're among the good people, demonstrating it. We're canceled for left publishers like Verso, right? We know it. It's been made clear to us, right? So recreating the publishing environment, recreating the left, reconstituting, academic and intellectual life, right? We're in a full-scale renewal, hopefully, period, right? Where the only resources are whatever, entrepreneurial, like Doug Lane's an entrepreneur, right? How's he going to do this? He's going to do it by running a successful small business, right? It's not that mysterious. So I think that, things can be done, Spencer, through self-organizational efforts. You have to create an environment in order to, in some sense, become yourself. Because, especially, and I would say that, for me, because I don't live in Chicago or New York, I can't, there's no real way for me to participate in a campaign for a socialist party, right? I live in a middle-sized city in Virginia, university town. for me, the question is, can there be an environment in which, the fundamental intellectual questions are raised? Can I help to contribute to that? Whether through platypus or appearances like this, or publication. That'd be my answer.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing all your erudition.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Spencer. And I appreciate the, sort of like the resonance with my feelings about academia. I also agree that you kind of have to make your own, a world in which you can actually think and thrive. And sometimes that's outside of academia. So also what we are doing. And yeah, we appreciate you coming on and wish you well.
No, I mean, when I read you, I just thought, wasn't the whole point of multiculturalism, to have women teach Plato and Aristotle, to have Black people teach American history, right?
Certainly.
Everything is a ghetto, right? Like the ghettoization of these things, right? I explain it to people. Like the whole point of multiculturalism is to make sure that nobody but white people teaches the American Revolution and the Civil War and, the classics and the history of Rome, and usually white men, right? So you have to have all these women's history and Black history and all this stuff. And those are the ghetto positions, right? South Asia history is a ghetto, right? It's where you put all the middle class nationalists. It's in other words, it's like a consolidation of what they claim to be opposing.
Right, and that totally stops people from using this information to think together. It just becomes a display or an expression or celebration or whatever you want to call it. But you can no longer use all that information to actually solve problems. And I think that functions very well for keeping things the way they are. So, yeah, we need to break through that and start to think clearly again. So I appreciate that.